So we're on to our fifth and last session on day one that looks at how bad news and corrective action gets communicated quickly when things go wrong. Does corporate leadership choose to maintain silence and create space for speculation? The topic is communication when silence is not golden. Our discussants are Mr. Ishat Hussain, who is acknowledged as an expert in financial management, overall management and operational control, and has vast experience in the areas of finance, banking, accounts, audit, taxation, and general management. He's a non-executive director on board of Tata Sons and former chairman of Voltas, and has played key roles in a number of Tata Group companies, especially as senior director on boards of Tata Steel, Tata Consultancy Services, and Titan. Mr. Naushir Mirza serves as a director on boards of some of India's leading public companies and is advisor to some international companies as well. He's also been the former senior partner of S.R. Bartley Boy and Company, the Indian partner of Ernst & Young, and former national director of Audit and Accounting Services and the managing partner of Western India. Mr. Mirza has also agreed to be the moderator for this session, and we have Ms. Apurva Purohit as the president of Jagran Group, who manages a diverse portfolio which includes print, radio, digital, and outdoor. She was earlier the CEO of Radio City and credited with making Radio City one of the largest and most profitable networks in the FM industry. She even got Radio City successfully listed on the stock exchanges. Ms. Purohit was the first president of the Association of Radio Operators of India, where she was at the forefront of resolving several industry issues, including the further deregulation and expansion of the medium in the country, and has over 3 decades of experience in media and entertainment industry, and serves on boards of directors of several companies and is an advisor to a private equity firm. So it's over to Mr. Mirza to begin the session.
Thank you. Good evening, friends, and let me start by saying thank you for staying back for this session, because we in the panel were wondering how large an audience would remain after 5 o'clock. Second, because you have sat through a whole day of speeches, what we have decided is, between the three of us, that we will have no opening remarks either, except they've been kind enough to give me the privilege of saying something for a few minutes, and the rest of the session will be conversation, obviously between the three of us, but with all of you included. So you are welcome to jump in and to speak. I know the mics can't go around, so just speak loudly. And therefore, those of you who do want to participate may want to come in front, as the lady already requested you to, because then I can catch your eye and give you the opportunity to. But if you sit at the back, I might miss you. So this session is on corporate communication. Let me put it like that. Now, many, many years ago, it was really many years ago, I'm an old man, my daughter opted to study English literature. So as usual, at some point after her decision was made, the point came up, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? True to form, I have no other understanding. So I said, maybe you want to join corporate communications. So looking me in the eye, she said coolly, Papa, I have no wish to devote the rest of my life to telling lies on behalf of fat, oily businessmen. So I looked at her and I said, you got it completely wrong, Meher. Businessmen now claim to run marathons. They are no longer fat. They're all very health conscious, and they have stopped oiling their hair. In spite of my very convincing response, she chose not to become a corporate communications manager. But my daughter's response tells us something about how people outside our world perceive what corporates communicate. We live in our own world, and we believe we communicate effectively. The outsiders think it's all a huge amount of spin that we are hearing. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're not doing so bad in spite of this negative start. I was looking at the Edelman Trust Survey. And Edelman is an organization that annually runs a survey of trust around the world. And I looked at where business ranks in this. actually business ranked quite well compared to politicians, and surprisingly compared to NGOs and some other types. So let me give you a few statistics that came out of a survey a few months ago. This is a global survey. 42% don't know which company to trust, but which means 58% do. 40% think CEOs and boards of directors are credible, which obviously means 60% don't. Now, I know between these two numbers there's a contradiction, but this is what the survey told me. And NGOs are certainly less trusted than businesses. So the issue that we have at the heart of communication is trust. And it's trust between the three broad organs of corporate governance: the shareholders, the boards of directors, and managements. And it's assumed or it's expected that there is trust between all three organs inter se, so that there is good communication. And what's at the heart of trust is transparent, honest communication. Because if you don't communicate or are not perceived to communicate honestly and transparently, there cannot be trust. So that is at the absolute heart of this thing. But what do we see in reality? My own experience of sitting, not just on company boards, but having been an auditor. So in total now I've spent more than 50 years in the corporate world, maybe a few years less than Ishat. But if I go all the way back to when I started my chartered accountancy, it's more than 50 years. We tend to put a positive spin on things. Negatives are presented positively, which is okay. But often without actually a solution to the negative, it's only given with a positive spin. Positives are played up beyond reasonable proportion to what those things are. As company leaders, we distrust the audience with whom we are communicating. We always fear that they will read something into what we are telling them. We're very cautious in how much we tell them, how we say it to them. Certainly, the kind of transparent, open communication that builds trust is not very strong in how we do these things. And finally, I've noticed in companies, wherever I have had to push them, there is a paranoia in company leaders of NGOs and of competition. So a lot of information, even statutory information that's required to be statutorily informed, is controlled or is restricted by this particular paranoia. And I have seen that again and again and again. Take a simple thing like segment information. Most companies are reluctant to reveal the real segments because of a fear that the competitors will see it. The information is minimal in segments, as many of you who are familiar with this know. You only give the revenues, you give as it were, the gross profit of a segment, that's it. But even that, people are terrified. The competition will know what each segment is doing. So I see this as one major element. And finally, what seems to influence management thinking is, in many cases, a certain amount of hubris, optimism, that things will go well. And therefore, what are the users of communication trying to do? They say, we have seen only the tip of the iceberg. We want to know what's under the water. And there's a lot of guessing on this, which results in rumors, which results in other challenges. So to sum up, there is, in spite of the Edelman survey, I think there is a crisis of trust in our corporate sector. And that crisis of trust has happened with the kind of things that have been happening in the last 2 years. I don't want to even go through the list of names of corporates and companies that have got into difficulties, many of which we are not able to even fathom as outsiders as to what on earth is going on, and some of that will come up as we go ahead. And many of these companies are reacting by using taking lawyers' advice, using PR agencies. They're not addressing the fundamental issue of how their behavior is being perceived by their stakeholders. Because if you go to a lawyer or a PR agency, the PR agencies are constantly being paid to only put a spin, and the lawyers are terrified about that you will get sued. As a result, you end up with a constipated kind of communication or a stultified communication with the readers of your messages. Many times, which means very little to those who read it. There's a lot of motherhood statements in there. We believe in shareholder value and long-term success and all that kind of claptrap, but nothing else comes out. So I think with these challenges, let me now move on, and I'll put the first question to my colleagues here, and then I'll welcome all of you to jump in. And the title of the session is, When is Silence Not Golden? And as I said in my remarks the last few minutes, we like to remain silent when there are negative things that are going to happen. And there have been many negative things that have happened even in the last 2 years. So let's take just one example where a key leader of a company, there are certain concerns about that key leader. There is, when Steve Jobs had cancer, Ishad gave me this very good example to use today in this thing. When Steve Jobs had cancer, how did Apple handle that particular information? A key leader is in trouble. When I find Naina has left, when R.K. Pachauri, there was a charge of sexual harassment, a man who was essentially embodied Tehri in himself, when there was a charge against Pachauri of this thing, and I can read out to you the kind of news reports that came out when this happened. And there have recently Yes Bank, the struggle between the two promoters. Apurva helped me with this particular example. What do you think, Ishat, what should be company leadership's response when such situations happen?
Naushad, that was a fantastic introduction, which you didn't share with me and Apurva, so let me congratulate you. You really set the context.
I don't want to spoil it all.
It really is trust. See, silence can never be golden.
Thanks.
Silence, I mean, that is a default position. Silence can never be golden. Yes, I think in a large number of cases, I don't know majority or not, in a large number of cases, there may be a desire to give a spin. But when you sit back and you are a decision maker, the problem is the timing of it, that when do you go public? So now, like in the Steve Jobs case, as you said, I think it was made known when his illness was reconfirmed, and also that it's going to be terminal. But yet, the SEC, after his death, has raised this issue that was it too late? Essentially, therefore, it becomes a question of when do I time it? All of us in this room, I think we are all honorable people, we've had this predicament. And if I take the example of, say, a bank, if you're the auditor of a bank, or if you're the board of a bank, if you go and announce to the world that, hey, listen, I'm in deep trouble, you'll be shut the next day. I mean, you know, that is what will happen. So I think that the challenge is to get the timing right. To resolve this issue of timing to some extent as to whether it will bring the house down, I would suggest that the right way to do is to involve the regulators. For example, if ILFS had a problem, why is it that the chairman of SIDBI, who just sits around the corner, he was the first guy to blow the whistle? Wouldn't it have been better if the the representatives of ILFS went and explained the problem to the regulator. Okay, hey, listen, we've got this problem. So I think the issue really is, how do you time it? Where if you don't have a regulator? Is it too early? Is it too late? Now, suppose you are in an industry which is seeing a downturn. If it is just a downturn, fine. But if it's really a structural issue, and it's a long-term decline, then you have to come out with it. And you know, there are some very nice parts of the annual accounts where you could make the MD&A, for example. In your MD&A discussions, you should not remain silent there. You've got to talk about the risks facing the business. So you mentioned that. I remember many years ago when Disney acquired ABC, the broadcasters. Disney, in their MD&A, came up with a clear statement that we have acquired this very large company, we have acquired it with a lot of debt, we will have to do a lot of cleaning up, so our earnings are going to be depressed for a few years. Now, therefore, as I said, my default option is silence is never golden. The catchphrase in India, I notice, is we do not respond to rumors. And here, I'd like to ask Apurva, since she comes from the media world, that, you know, the media tends to force managements into positions. They'll pick up some little rumor here or there, and then they'll start ringing relevant people up. And that also builds up a pressure. So you had laid out the triumvirate who have to work in consonance. I think there is a problem here also that media is, and then, by the way, having come up with an announcement and the event happens, we were the first to report it, you know? And mind you, this is not an Indian phenomenon. I see the FT also does it and all the others also do it. So that's where I'm on this.
But Apurva, before you respond to that, let me read, I mentioned Terry and Pachauri.
Yeah.
Let me read a report somewhere here, which came in the media. It was in Live Mint. So, you know, it's not one of the little scandal-prone newspapers on this whole thing. Yeah, I'll just read it. It's a little long. I'm not reading the whole thing, but it says, what does Terry's ongoing handling of a complaint of sexual harassment against its former DG, Rajendra Pachauri, by a woman researcher tell us? Certainly not a lot about the process of fair play and justice at the not-for-profit think tank, and perhaps a great deal about how a relatively new law, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment, POSH had then just come in, designated to protect women, plays out. Terry's lessons from the day the researcher leveled these charges to the announcement of Pachauri's appointment as executive vice president in February do not bode well. What should have been a test case for POSH has been reduced to a brazen disregard for the norms of public probity and decency. Very strong adjectives. And now it names the board of Terry, who, according to the report, are fiddling while Pachauri does his thing. This is not a public trial or a witch hunt by innuendo. Pachauri's behavior has been examined by an internal complaints committee, which in May last year found merit in the complaint against him. Instead of acting on this report, its governing council, which comprises stalwarts like Deepak Parekh and Naina Lal Kidwai, I warned Naina that I'm going to mention this, so perhaps she thought it best not to remain, and several others. It's very eminent people who wrote the foreword, that's unimportant. So stalwarts like Deepak and Naina, to their shame, did nothing, waited politely for Pachauri to get a stay, and now express helplessness because of that. So you can see how the pressure that Ishad spoke about. Now those who are aware of what was actually happening in Terry understand the situation. But the fact of the matter is, there was a public perception that this galaxy of stars is doing damn all, while this poor woman had eventually resigned. Even the head of the complaints committee, who had inquired into this and held Pachauri guilty, resigned. So what on earth are these galaxy of stars doing? And this was a perception. I don't blame the editor of Live Mint, because she based her perception on all that management or the company or organization was communicating. Apurva, now having...
So firstly, I want to complain to Mr. Damodaran that I've been brought here under false pretenses, right?
Sorry.
I was not going to
to
be
defend
seen
the media.
Defend media. Okay, the other thing is both these gentlemen told me that, okay, you sit in the center, you are the flower between two thorns. It's turning out to be a two-pronged attack at me.
Sorry.
So next question.
No. I will answer. On a serious note, I will answer this question. So I think it's a very fair question that media is becoming the judge, the jury, and deciding the punishment without checking, and how do and there's so much pressure that is getting built up on organizations when you hear about all these reports. How does one react to it? So I will answer this question from a media perspective also, and as a person who's also part of an organization running two listed entities. So I think the way to look at it is media has a job to do, right? One part of media, which is the serious media, etc., has a job, and print media especially, where they check and they fact check, and after they fact check twice, and then there's editors who have to ensure that the news that because they also have a reputation to maintain, right? So credible information, they have to ensure it's credible and then publish it, because that's their role is to be true to the reader, to give him information and accurate information. So that's one part. Then there is, of course, the whole tabloidy world, which sort of survives on rumor mongering and
Live Mint.
And not Live Mint,
and
and therefore scandals. And again, that has been there for several years, several centuries. Now it is up to us.
Blitz at one
absolutely.
time.
So it is up to us as organizations whether are we going to get pressurized by that media. And today we can talk about and say, my God, there's so much pressure. How do I react? What do I do? My reputation is getting besmirched as a consequence of what media is doing. Then what about the content that is coming out digitally today? Media has now actually not become the place where all the scandals are broken or talked about. It's social media. It's what our ex-employees are writing about us on Glassdoor and other such forums. We can't stop that. We can't stop what somebody says on Twitter. So the point is that we really can't stop whether it is media or whether it is social media or whether it is our ex-employees from spreading or talking falsehoods about ourselves. I think the answer lies in not pointing fingers at media, because the same media has also been used by these stars to build their reputation. As a media owner, I know how many calls I get from celebrities, celebrity leaders who want to be covered. Yeah. Now, once you have put your life in the public domain, you cannot now tell media that talk only about the good things about me. So you should then make a choice that I don't want to be in the public domain, or I want to build my status as a celebrity and I want to be in the public domain. And then you have to be prepared for both bouquets and brickbats. So I think that's what I would like to answer on the specific media question. Now coming to what Ishad said about timing, and that that silence is not golden. And I think the only place where silence is golden is between a married couple. So I think the longer you're married, the better it is. Yeah? Would you agree?
The less you speak, the longer you're married. Yeah.
So
you're right, I agree about that.
I think silence is truly golden.
I practice it also,
golden at that point. So I think a very valid point that when do you say that? And I personally, have faced this kind of issue several times. So one is, issues like there's something wrong with the KMP, the CEO. So when do you communicate it? There is a dispute between two promoters, but you don't know how the dispute, where it will resolve, where will it go. So do you scare the markets by telling them, and then you realize later on that actually it just got resolved? Yeah. So I think the timing and the judgment of the board and the judgment of senior management in this is hypercritical. When do I know that from speculation it's moved to information, from a low probability it's moved to high probability? And that's the time to communicate. I also think equally important is not only the when, but what to communicate. I always find that when there's bad news, so newsprint prices are going up and therefore there's pressure on margins. Of course, I have to communicate. Yeah. But if I communicate it to investors and shareholders along with a management response on how I'm dealing with it, what is the corrective action that I'm taking in managing margins, I find that in that case, it becomes so much easier to give out bad news, and in turn, stakeholders receive it much better because they also know good things and bad things will happen. Yeah. But is management responding, and are you telling us what my response is to the bad news? I think when you are able to club it, so Steve Jobs is going to pass away, but my successor is in place. Yes. I think you get your answer, and then you should be able to communicate.
Anyone want to say something at this point? Okay, I'll continue. Take the case of ICICI Bank, this thing which happened less than a year ago. And, rather in the early stages, its board reached a conclusion at that point of time. And M.K. Sharma, who incidentally I shared a panel with on this very stage 1 year ago, M.K. Sharma, who was the chairman then, came out with a public statement saying we have implicit faith in the CEO. There could not have been any influencing of the loan committee's decision because the loan committee has independent directors and so on. She may have chaired the meeting, but that's not relevant. And there is no truth in any of these rumors. To many of us from the outside, whether the media wrote it or not, that was not relevant. To many of us from the outside, it didn't sound like a wise statement to have made. And 3 months later, they finally did what was plain much before that as to what they should have done. So all of the things they did 3 or 4 months afterwards, they ought to have actually done at the beginning. So Apurva mentioned it's important both the timing and the judgment. The timing was okay. The problem came out, and I think the bank was right and the board was right to communicate. They should have communicated. If they had kept silent, that wouldn't have been good for the bank. But they communicated the wrong thing. Their judgment was not right, because what they were addressing, according to me, was a sort of legal framework that nothing has been proven. It's just allegations. There is no basis to them. How can we even imply that maybe there is some guilt, because there is no proof of it? But they were not addressing the public perception that something is wrong. Dal mein kala hai. And these guys are just mesmerized by their CEO. And they have come out with this particular statement, more than likely written by her and dictated to the board of directors. This was the kind of talk that went around in circles. And I think that's an issue of judgment. So Ishat, what do you think? You were right about ILNFS, or even in the bank. If you come out too soon, it could sink the bank.
Yeah, I think Apurva has laid down a clear ground rule that a lot is required in judgment. And it's very easy for me in hindsight to comment on it. It wouldn't be fair. But I think, as I said, the default is silence is never golden. But at that point, silence would have been better till you have all the facts in place. Yes. If you recall, just around that time, the great Martin Sorrell was the creator of WPP. He was in trouble over a matter, and I was comparing and contrasting how that was being handled and how this was being handled.
Well said.
You know, the social media, as you said, had already let it out that Martin Sorrell was a naughty boy. So it was there. And the board, all that the board said, we are looking into the matter. A committee has been set up, and we will report back as soon as we have the results.
Good. Yeah.
So, you know, it wasn't either you cleared Martin or you condemned Martin.
Yeah.
So it's this nuance.
Yeah.
But underlying this must be a desire on the part of people and organizations that we want to be transparent.
Yeah. Yeah.
The underlying desire should be there. You shouldn't start from this position that, you know, I'm going to give everything a twist, which is now happening, you said in your opening remarks. There's a lot of spin bowling going on, which was first done in the political world, but which is now creeping into the business world. So that's what I feel, that in that particular instance, again, I qualified by saying I have the knowledge of hindsight. They didn't. But when I contrast it and compare it with some other examples, I thought they jumped the gun too early.
Yeah. Any more comments? Well, any comments. You guys haven't made a single one so far. Are any of you aware of good examples of communicating bad news by companies? Any of you can think of any? I must admit, I couldn't think of it. Apurva can think of.
So you know, to carry forward that example, I think we don't understand that reputations are not built by reputational management companies, or reputations are not built by what we say. Reputations are actually built by our daily actions. Okay, so on a daily basis, if you have been consistent in saying that I will share both the good news and bad news to the best of my knowledge as much as possible, and that is a continuing theme of an organization that sort of builds its reputation. And we try to say that perception is actually not reality, but perception is based on this action that you take. So again, a recent example, BCCI. So when there was an accusation of a sexual harassment case, again, justified or unjustified is the second part. But the immediate action the board took, let's not talk about what happened subsequently, but the immediate action the board took is send the CEO on leave. And it's very fair to do that. It's not that you're harming that person's reputation. You're saying that I don't know whether this is true or not true, but as a board, as the management, I have zero tolerance for this. And this is the action that you're communicating. By taking this action, you're communicating, I have zero tolerance for. That itself, I think, safeguards the organization's reputation.
And actually, adding to the point you made a little earlier, if you want to be a CEO, be prepared that, or a chairman or anybody of any consequence, there could be a Me Too allegation against you, because that's the easiest thing today to charge a person with. My colleagues always tell me it's a surprise, you haven't had any so far. Be that as it may. The fact is that's always possible, and the board may well take the action of asking you to go on leave. And you shouldn't take this as, but I am completely faultless, why are you putting me in a position where a perception? I'm afraid then don't get into any position where such an allegation can result in your having stepped down from a board or go on leave or whatever particular action. Because this is now a very real possibility that boards are being required to take. And the old format or paradigm of response, I think, does not apply any. Coming to social media, both of you rightly mentioned it. I sit on the board of Thermax, and in our board we have an eminent, brilliant director, I like him very much, a man called Harsh Mariwala. All of you have heard of him. Now, when Harsh sits in the meeting, I mean, you've got about a 7 or 8 minute attention span. The board meeting goes on for 4 or 5 hours. So that 7 or 8 minute comes back. With the rest of the time, he's I don't know what he does, tweeting or Facebook or whatever. He's an inveterate social media user. I was about to say activist, but user. Yeah. Now, there's some pros and cons, and the example of some of you may have seen just very recently, Elon Musk.
Correct.
That he quite foolishly tweeted that I'm going to take this company private because he had been in conversation with some Saudi financiers, and they had led him to believe that they will fund the buyback of public stock, and he can take it private. But he had not shared it with anybody in his own organization. The board of directors were taken by surprise. His own general counsel in the company was taken by surprise, because when he put this tweet out, within minutes they all asked him, is this true? And you have seen how swiftly, unlike in our country, within 2 or 3 months, how swiftly the SEC has acted and punished him for what he did. But that's not the point of the argument. Is it a good thing for business leaders to be active on social media? Because they may either in their enthusiasm do something that they shouldn't do, or worse, you tweet constantly, but when something bad happens about your company, people expect you within the next 30 seconds to give a response to that tweet. And sometimes you may have a challenge tweeting. At least if you are not a tweeter, then you can say, I haven't even heard of it, give me a little while to understand it. But if you're a guy who sits in board meetings constantly responding to tweets, but then if you are in the public eye, if you're running Marico, it's a part of your marketing strategy to be very active in social media. So it is helping the business. Maybe the head of a steel business or something doesn't need to, Ishan.
But it depends what you are tweeting. Yeah. I mean, the biggest and the most powerful tweeter is Mr. Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I think I think he's taking it to the other extreme. But for the specific purposes of our meeting today, I don't think I would like to tweet about the financial health of the company, the financial performance of the company. You can say that if I was Harsh Mariwala, that Saffola is good for your heart. I tweet that. But I certainly wouldn't tweet about my earnings forecast or anything like that. So you have to be very, very careful about what you tweet or what you communicate to your employees. If there is some reorganization which is taking place within the organization, and that you want to communicate to the people the reason for it, what is the rationale, I would go along with that. But anything to do with price-sensitive information or anything like that, I would certainly abstain.
The lady there, yes. A little loudly. Yeah.
Thomas and I sit on a board with him.
Yes.
And when you started off by saying that, that 7 to 8 minutes and how he's always looking down, I thought you were going to say that in those 7 to 8 minutes, the kind of contribution that he
100%.
makes and the incisiveness with which he asks those questions.
Absolutely.
And just to add on, I follow him on Twitter. He does not tweet about the company at all.
I agree.
It's nothing to do with Marico.
Yeah.
It's more like,
but if there is something negative about the company,
he would come to know.
No, he would come to know, and he doesn't respond on Twitter.
Correct.
People say, you constantly tweeting about everything on earth. And now here is a message negative about your company in the last 10 minutes. Why are you so silent, Mr. Mariwala? What challenge has he got?
So I think the question here is not whether you should
He's
tweet.
a great contributor, I agree on that.
Yeah. The question is not whether is it right to tweet or right not to tweet. The question here is consistency. So I'm a big believer in consistency, and I've made that point earlier also, that reputations are made not by that one action that you took or didn't take, but by the consistency of your actions. Are you doing the same thing again and again and again? So if you've decided I will not ever speak about my business, and my tweet is a personal tweet, and you're constantly, come hell or high water, come good news or bad news, I will not tweet about my company. I think that's perfectly fine. But if you've decided that you are now an inveterate tweeter and you will tweet about anything and have opinions on your own company, and not, then you jolly well be prepared to answer all questions. And you must answer all questions. And I think if you are a CEO, the least that is expected of you is to have the judgment to be a sieve of what should I say and what I should not say. I mean, we deal with so much information, so much communication, and if we as leaders are not able to sieve it through and say, this is what I need to pass on at this appropriate time, including what I say, then I don't think in the first place you should be a CEO.
Good. Yes?
I was wondering whether a listed company, which is kind of very much in the public, the CEO, if he wishes to maintain a private tweeting profile, should it not be camouflaged and let there, because you're there for a listed company, which is a well-known company, and there could be some news or the other on which an official response is required at a tweet forum. In that case, isn't it better to have, let's say, an official CEO account and keep the personal CEO account camouflaged so that you're not confusing things in order to avoid any communications disaster later on?
I mean, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, unless you're doing it to be in the public eye, then of course the purpose is not served by yeah. Yeah. Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Potentially compromise. I thought it's better to just safeguard two domains.
You can do, yeah.
I have a question. On the one hand, we talk about the CEO being transparent, openly ready to take on negative communication. But if that turns out to be false, and the person who raised that issue is not punished in some manner, and that is also in public domain, I think we're running a major risk. So is there any method by which we get to know that there was a false allegation made by somebody who spoiled the reputation of somebody? He can go for defamation suit, that's a separate story. That might take some years to conclude. But what is the punishment that the person who raised a wrong signal or wrong information? And how is that handled and how is that punished? If there is no contra of that nature, then I think we are running the risk of single-sided aspect, which is not fair.
I 100%. I don't know if any of you are aware of how can you punish somebody in the public who even with their name attached, makes a completely baseless allegation.
So I don't know about public, whether, because then you are making it a, public issue. One person maligned somebody publicly, and then that has turned out to be false. And you then publicly quarter that person. But I know for a fact that within the organization, for example, we put up enough steps in place that if you are a whistleblower and your complaint turns out to be false, then you will be asked to go. Yeah. So I think one can do that within the organization. I'm not sure how one can do that publicly.
I don't know.
Whistleblower who has a confidentiality
different,
yes.
yeah.
But there is something which is called protecting the whistleblower. Of course, the government didn't do it, so people were killed. But so long we ensure that the whistleblower's identity is protected, I have no problem. But if the whistleblower has got published with his or her name on a Me Too kind of situation, then suddenly you find it's totally false allegation. The person gets away with murder.
Take an example, an NGO writes that this factory is leaking poison into the drinking water, river, or whatever. And it's completely untrue. And after some time that's established. But what then can be done? I don't know. I don't think.
I think you just
I'm not
have
aware.
to,
Yeah, Anjali?
You have to proceed legally, unless you get our dons in Dubai to come and sort it out. You just have to proceed legally.
Yes.
I mean, there's
I think
law
that
of
gentleman
libel, there's law of...
No, I think Anjali has some response to this one.
Sorry? On phone.
Only
Yeah,
burner
bolo
phones.
Anjali. Yeah.
No, I was actually just going to say what Ishat mentioned is there are always legal routes, and I think it is time companies started exercising them. If there are frivolous complaints and things that tarnish the reputation, well-earned, well-guarded reputation of a company or its related individuals, legal remedies are available. I am wondering if there is a view on how many companies actually put in place a social media policy for its board, for its officers and senior management.
Very good, agreed. But there is a question there, we'll do that and then we'll certainly address social media. Yeah, bolo.
I'm Vishal Javeri. What I would like to state is that as far as a listed entity is concerned, the major corporate communication takes place in the form of material price sensitive information.
That's right.
And SEBI, by the insider trading regulations and by the listing regulations, has prescribed specific parameters that have to be adhered by a listed entity while following the principle silence is golden and while following the principle silence is not golden. So SEBI says you disclose when the information is material, price sensitive, and when it is factual and when it is complete in all aspects. And SEBI says you don't disclose when a disclosure of a premature information would create a false market.
Absolutely.
So there are rules in place for a listed entity as far as corporate communications is concerned. Now, it's a quite a usual phenomena that stock exchange writes to listed companies that so-and-so article has been published in the media, so what's your take on that? So it's a very far-fetched thought pattern which I'm presenting right now, is that for a listed company or any person associated with the listed company, even communication of price-sensitive information or unpublished price-sensitive information is an offense under the insider trading regulations. So the media sources that information, whether true or not, it depends, but it sources the information and it publishes. So indirectly, media is publishing an unpublished price-sensitive information which no one is supposed to disclose. So can the media be implicated as alleged to be violating the insider trading regulations by procuring unpublished price-sensitive information and publishing publicly?
Very good question. I'm not sure this panel has any legal competence to respond unless Apurva's newspaper has already researched this kind of thing.
No, so the issue is not about media accessing that information and therefore is media culpable or not. The issue really is the person who has leaked, because that information has come from somewhere, right?
Right, even after procuring the information, communicating the information further is an offense under the insider trading regulations.
It's not restricted only to insiders communicating, any third party.
Any person.
Okay, I think Damodran has a view.
Moving away from unpublished price-sensitive information, recently in the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice lost his temper because something that was to be filed confidentially found its way to the media. And one of the suggestions made to the court, in open court by a lawyer, was send for the editor of that publication which put it out and then deal with him. But better sense prevailed. They said, no, we can't fault the editor for this because he or she's got the information. And they are in the business of disseminating news so long as they have some idea that it's correct. And here it was 100% correct because they had a transcript of it. So the question is not going after the media. But I wanted you to comment on one other matter, moving away from this, is you discussed when should information be disseminated or communicated. My point is who should communicate, because I've seen a lot of cases where when good news is there to communicate, the chief executive officer is available to communicate. When bad news is there, some poor PRO is sent with some note and he doesn't have information for supplementary questions and the press eats him for breakfast, nobody is bothered. Is that the way to go about communicating?
Yeah. Any views, Isha?
Well, certainly it should be consistent. It can't be heads I win, tails you lose. But I've never seen really bad news being ever communicated, apart from the results are very bad and it's sent to the stock exchange and it's disseminated. But give me an example where really some bad news is being communicated.
I'll tell you the opposite,
Yeah.
which is something that appeals to me. Remember when we had a failure in one of our space projects, and Satish Dhawan was then Abdul Kalam's boss.
Yeah.
He pushed Kalam aside and said, I will deal with this. I will talk about the failure to the media. Few months later, when they actually succeeded and Kalam went to him and said, why don't you talk to the media? He said, you are the project director. Yes. You talk to them. Yes. But corporates somehow seem to turn it on its head. You don't have enough Satish Dhawans in the business, unfortunately.
So I don't know whether that's necessarily true, because it may be true in parts, but I think the larger point again is that when you are communicating, what you are communicating, as the panel discussed, is equally important. And I realize that, and I've seen this repeatedly happening in several interactions with whether it's media, investors, stakeholders, that you give good news, you give bad news. You give bad news with a management response, with an actionable, with a plan of how you are going to mitigate that, and that can finally be only done by the chief executive. And I realize that this kind of communication has actually, and I don't want to name names even in media, but when organizations are doing this, there is a 30% upside on shareholder value. There's a 30% difference on good corporate communication, which is communicating equally bad news and good news constantly and consistently. And there's a 30% downside when you do these kind of things. Just come in when there's good news and then send your PR to.
Yeah. Actually, if I can just support what you're saying, Apurva, it's my ill fortune to sit on at least 2 boards which have had several impairments of assets, and they've had to write down those assets. And inevitably, when they've finally acknowledged that there is an impairment, it has been received very positively by the investing public. They say, we are glad you have acknowledged this. We already guessed this was impaired. So now that you have acknowledged it, it sort of gives us comfort that you people are understanding your own business. And you are reasonably honest. I mean, you didn't kick the can even further down the road. Maybe a couple of quarters after we cottoned on, you people have seemed to realize that there is an impairment, because most managements are optimistic and they never like to accept that things have gone sour. But I've still got Anjali's question to answer. So can we, not question, but it was a little rhetorical. She asked, how many organizations have a social media policy that percolates right down from the CEO down to the peon? Because everybody is now active on social media. And if the peon says, I am a peon of so-and-so company and I think the Prime Minister is a crook, then the company gets associated with that particular tweet or whatever these things are. So how many in this audience can you put your hand up if your company has a policy? Oh my God, none?
No, there are.
Or there are, but they are not aware they have a policy. Very few. Anjali, good question. It's only 4 or 5 hands that have gone up. Yeah. Some of them are putting their hand up twice to get down. Yeah. It's okay, we can put it down now.
We are waiting for the government to come up with a notification.
Gosh.
Well, good one.
Gosh. Chalo.
Yeah.
You had a point.
No, I think there is a policy
Yeah.
in some companies,
Yeah.
but I don't think they put it between 2 covers and called it a social media policy. There is a kind of
Communication
policy imperative that is there in some companies, not in too many. But I wanted the panel to spend a couple of minutes explaining what are the lessons that we learned from Cadbury and Nestle.
Yeah. Facetiously, of course, I can say Amitabh Bachchan saved Cadbury, but let's not be. Come, what, Ishat, you want to?
I'm not particularly au fait with the facts.
See, both of them, Cadbury's had those worms thing,
and
Nestle had that lead or something in their ash or lead or something in their noodles, Maggi noodles. So they got out of a pretty bad brand impairment. Now again, we are not talking of corporate as a business thing, it was a brand major brand impairment. Okay. Anjali, you have any?
So, I think what are the lessons to learn from these two instances? One is that, you know, when something goes wrong, it goes wrong in hugely, dramatically, uncontrollably. You know, it was one instance of worms, and I think the sales of Cadbury's dropped by some 30-40%, and it took them 3 years. Amitabh Bachchan, this, that, and the other to sort of come back to the position. And here, that reputation they had built over a period of time, etc., nothing seemed to matter because that became such a huge and, you know, never should we wish this on our, you know, worst competitors also, that kind of mess. I think the lesson here was that quickly you need to react and get media on your side. Media on your side in the sense that this is what's happened, I'm containing it, and quickly the action points have to be not only done but communicated. The other thing is that they had to sort of over-index on getting the packaging. So what could have worked with one thin foil, they put 3 levels the amount of foil so that it never ever happens. So they had to over-index it, which took a lot of cost, a lot of time, a lot of effort. But it had to be done, and again, that communication had to be done of that fast. But final lesson is that, you know, reputations get damaged overnight, and building up is a minimum 3-year effort, and the 3 years of action, communicating the action, assuming that the communication has not been understood, as G.B. Shaw has said that the biggest mistake we make in communication is assuming that it's happened, right? So keep on communicating, and then...
Well done, Apurva. You know, because about 3 or 4 years after the Cadbury thing, I talked to one of the directors as to how did you handle this, and she said exactly what they did at that time. This is about 17, 18 years ago, this Cadbury thing, Ishat.
I can't recollect it, but
no. But and a similar thing with the Maggi noodles.
The Nestle Maggi noodles, you know, the whole debate got completely lost because everybody said that a certain gentleman from the north who suddenly had become a great guy, he was behind it. So for simpletons like me, I was prepared to go along with the conspiracy theory, and I continued to eat Maggi noodles. Though it may surprise you that I eat Maggi noodles, they're quite nice. So the debate got all lost there, but what's your impression? Do you think they were too slow on they changed the CEO and now the new guys come in and apparently the sales have still gone up. So is it your case? They were slow on it. But I thought it was also being fanned by that competitor. It was being fanned by a very powerful competitor who has a lot of support everywhere. So.
And I also think, you know, on all these issues, whether it's things like Nestle or Cadbury or any communication, that there cannot be a contradiction between the action you are taking and the communication you are making. Right, because often that is a big error. So for example, for example, Radio City has gone through 2 acquisitions. So we were sold from Star to a private equity fund, and from a private equity fund to the Jagran Group. And through the life of Radio City, when I was the CEO, everybody knew that you're owned by a private equity fund, right? And therefore there's going to be an exit. Now, obviously, because everybody knows that there's going to be an exit, constantly the employees are in a state of, they're under pressure, they don't feel secure, and constantly conversations keep on happening with takeaway from doing business. So how do you tackle that? I can't on the one hand keep on telling them, no, please feel secure, you're here for the long term, and at outside talking to potential buyers. So you have
it's very unnerving.
So you have to be consistent. So you have to be very open internally to your employees and say, okay, listen, yes, you are owned by a private equity fund. One day you will get sold. Yes, we are in talks, but You made a note.
Transparency in your communication.
So both ways,
Yeah.
action inside and.
But you know, going along with Mr. Damodharan's point, I'm really surprised about how Boeing is handling this crash which took place in Indonesia. Because from whatever is coming out in the press, I get the impression
They're not doing anything.
there was a manual issue, that they had changed something, and this is what appears to me, may not be the facts, that there was something, they made a change, and they're saying, well, it was there in our manual, and it was put deep into the manual. And Boeing is not responding to that. This keeps coming up, coming up. And it's a major thing. You know, we've got the same planes here in India.
3-4 days ago, I flew on
traveling in one of those.
jet, and the pilot announced, this is our new Boeing 737 MAX.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I
So
suddenly
I'm really
remembered
surprised,
God. So anyway, as you can see, I'm still here. Yeah. So okay, I think now there is a few minutes left. Is there anything else anyone wants to talk about before we conclude? Okay, since there is nothing, if I can just sum up broadly what we have been talking about, and I think the 3 or 4 things I noted in this, and I'll go through the points I have here which we did cover. I think the first point is, be cognizant of the perception and the opinion of the people you are communicating to, as also any other persons who are going to draw conclusions from that particular communication. So you may be communicating only to your shareholders, but your customers or your employees or others are drawing conclusions from the communication you are doing. So be cognizant of that. Second, be consistent, and I think they made that point again and again. Be consistent in what you do, how you communicate, be proactive in how you communicate, because don't wait for events to overtake you. And the example of Maggie noodles, in some respects, as you said, that they haven't responded adequately. Ishat's example of Boeing, I agree entirely that what's happening? We're all sitting in their aeroplanes and we're not hearing anything. Communicate both correct information and complete information. So don't just put the bits that are positive or to your advantage and gloss over the not so good bits of information, because the readers of your information or the receivers of that information are intelligent human beings, and then they'll be constantly looking for what I call the iceberg that is under the water. I think broadly, get the bad news out on time. Don't sit on your hands and wait that somehow this will go away. And even more so now with social media, nothing will go away. Worse, it will get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the quicker you respond sensibly, the more you will be able to contain the damage that's being caused. Don't underestimate the receivers of your information. And of course, there was the very good advice to all of us that in matrimonial matters, silence is golden, which I entirely endorse after many, many years of being in that state. And let me tell you, there's one more thing, Ishat. There's an old adage that it is better to remain silent and to be thought a fool than to open your mouth and dispel all doubt. So with that final bit of advice to all of us, it says time's up. So time is up. Thank you all very much.
Just one clarification.
Sure, Bolo.
You are stressing this point about in marital relationship, which spouse are you referring to? That you need to clarify.
Oh my. Silence is golden, Ishat. Silence is
Thank you very much. May I request Mr. Damodharan to please do us the honors of presenting small tokens of appreciation to our panelists. Thank you very much for a very animated and engrossing discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the close of day one of Gatekeepers of Governance. We will meet here tomorrow and begin with some great stars. We've got Mr. Parekh in our first session, followed by Ms. Arundhati Bhattacharya in the second. So we expect you to be inside the hall by about 9:45 so that we can start on time. Please be here early enough for you to be able to get the best seats in the house. Thank you.
Just to supplement what she said, you've heard several mentions of Deepak Parekh when Arun Nanda was here, but what Deepak did and didn't do. Tomorrow you'll get a chance to quiz him on that, so turn up.